Alright guys, let's finish up chapter 18. This Torvald Knucklemeat is not very nice. And it seems like just when they think that it's time to go, he is catching on. Who exactly is Sophie Quire? Knucklemeat stepped closer. More important, there's a bounty on your head. And that's not something I turn my nose up at. So that means he doesn't ignore that type of stuff. Don't you touch her, Peter said, charging toward the man. Without missing a beat, Knucklemeat fired off one of his guns, knocking Peter's hat clean off his crown. Easy, hero. I'd much rather tie you up than bury you, but if you keep on like that, bury you I will. He slid the emptied pistol into the bandolier around his waist and drew a fresh one. How's about you stow that blade? So he's saying, put away that blade. I can't stow it, Peter said. He pulled up his sleeve to reveal the iron cap at the end of his arm. Sophie found herself again awed by the sight. She wondered what might have caused such horrible scars. Do you guys remember what happened? It was when he was trying to kill his uncle, right? That giant metal, blades, and he reached in to try taking it off and practically cut it off. Couldn't save it. Knucklemeat whistled, peering at the blade. Is that giant forged? I never seen the stuff up close. Definitely valuable. Wonder if it'll hurt when I cut it off. He grabbed a pile of shackles that lay in the bed and slung it over his shoulder. Onto the ground, all three of you. We're taking a little trip. He stepped back from the gate, hands nice and high. Sophie approached the edge of the wagon, but Peter did not move. He was facing the man, jaw clenched, his breathing shallow. Sophie put a hand on his sleeve. Peter, don't. The boy did not seem to hear at first, but then lowered his blade. You really think thieves are that horrible? He said. I think dying is horrible, she whispered. So let's listen to the man and get down from the wagon, please. For me? That's right, lover boy, called Knucklemeat. Listen to your girlfriend and get down here. I told you I'm not his girlfriend, Sophie snapped. She picked up her skirts and climbed off the back of the wagon. Between the book and her dress, it was hardly graceful, but at least she made it without falling into the mud. Sir Toad hopped down with little trouble and joined her side. Stay back, Sophie, he said under his breath, so quiet that Knucklemeat could not hear. And whatever you do, don't make any sudden sounds. The knight was watching Peter with a look of intense concentration. Sophie looked up at Peter, who was still on the wagon. Fine, Peter said with a note of resignation. He raised his hands in surrender and jumped down from the bed. His feet hit the mud and he slipped forward. Whoa! He cried, colliding straight into Knucklemeat. Watch it, the man shouted. He grabbed Peter by the coat and shoved him hard against the wagon gate. He pressed his arm into Peter's neck, choking him. You think it's smart to test a man with a gun? Guns are a coward's weapon, Peter said coldly. They're for people too afraid to get their hands dirty. Knucklemeat struck Peter across the face with the handle of his gun and then pressed the muzzle against his cheek. Do I seem afraid to you? Peter! Sophie tried to run toward him, but Sir Toad held her back. He knows what he's doing, the knight warned. Sophie, however, was unconvinced. Knucklemeat had Peter pinned against the wagon, a loaded pistol aimed at his face. The boy, for his part, looked utterly unafraid. She heard a soft click as Knucklemeat drew back the flint hammer with his thumb. Any last words, hero? More of a question, Peter cleared his throat. How do you plan to shoot me with an unloaded gun? He held out his open hand. A small lead bullet lay nestled in his palm. How? Knucklemeat pulled the trigger in his weapon, but it responded with a dull click. That's impossible. He pulled the trigger again and again, refusing to believe. How? Sophie could not have said it better herself. She stared at the boy, her mouth open. You stole a bullet out of a loaded gun? She had seen Peter do incredible things, but this was entirely too much. Peter grinned at her. Maybe thieves aren't all that bad. Knucklemeat stepped back from Peter, his face bloodless. A neat trick. But there's a reason I keep spares at the ready. He threw his useless weapon aside and reached for another pistol. What happened next was very hard for Sophie to understand. In a heartbeat, Peter had somehow leaped onto the wagon gate and then flipped over Knucklemeat's head. In a single singing motion, he whipped his blade down the man's back, cutting clean through his gun belt, which fell to the ground, leaving the man unarmed. He kicked Knucklemeat square in the rump and the man tumbled down to his knees and into the mud with a tremendous squish. "Bravo!" Sir Toad cried, then turned to Sophie. "Told you he knew what he was doing." Knuckle Meat lay on the ground, helpless. Peter's silver blade pointed at his throat. "What now, boy?" he growled. "You going to gut me?" Peter stepped back and picked up the shackles that Knuckle Meat had dropped when he fell. "No. Now we're going to the Baron's castle." He threw the chains into the man's lap. "And you're going to take us there." The journey through the Grimwald took longer than Sophie anticipated. The forest seemed to grow wilder with every passing mile. The paths through the forest were muddy and narrow, many of them choked with ivy and weeds. Knuckle Meat sat beside Sophie on the driver's bench, clutching the reins, shackles jangling from his hands. He was singing a disgusting tavern song called "The Maggot and the Corpse," a song whose length seemed to be limited only by the number of body parts the singer could call to mind. Sophie, meanwhile, passed her time browsing through the Book of Who, reading various entries about fantastical people long forgotten. Despite what Professor Cake had told her, she found it difficult to reconcile the notion that these were not merely storybook characters, but actual people who had lived and walked upon the earth. She happened, by chance really, to turn to the entry on Peter Nimble, which she had first read in the shop. One line in particular leaped out at her. The wielder of the fantastic eyes. So he has the fantastic eyes she keeps seeing, and it keeps talking about him. She looked back at Peter, who was crouched in the bed of the wagon, keeping a careful watch over Knuckle Meat. Watch, in his instance, being a term of art. Or was it? She stared at the blindfold wrapped tightly around his eyes. "Peter," she said, closing the book, "can I talk to you about something? Personal?" Peter shifted slightly. "If it's about how much you despise thieves, I'd rather you didn't." Sophie ignored this comment and continued. "When I first opened the Book of Who, I found an entry about you in it. The book said you had fantastic eyes. And then later in the professor's library, you made it sound as though you weren't blind at all. This was not exactly a question, but her meaning was clear." "That's because I'm not blind," Peter said, still facing forward. "Not anymore, at least." Sophie noticed that Sir Toad had turned around to listen to the conversation. Perhaps he too was curious about Peter's answer. "My eyes were pecked out by ravens when I was a baby," he said after a moment. Sophie could tell that the memory still pained him. "I grew up completely blind, and that was all I knew. But then I met Professor Cake." "Fantastic eyes," she said. "The professor restored your sight?" It was a bit more complicated than that," he said, scratching Sir Toad between the ears. "Maybe Sir Toad can tell you about it when you've got the time. And knowing the way he goes on, you'd need a lot of time." Peter had said this as if he were hoping to change the subject, but Sophie was not ready for that. "I don't understand," she said. "If you can see, why do you still wear a blindfold?" Peter shrugged. He looked to be considering his words very carefully. "I'm not ungrateful for what the professor did. I just feel more comfortable this way. I feel more like myself." "Fantastic eyes," Knuckle Meat muttered next to Sophie. "Should have known it wasn't no ordinary blind boy who swiped my bullet." This was meant as a gripe, but Sophie thought he looked considerably comfortable by the thought that he had been bested by some magical force. Chapter 19. The Book of Luck.